So, there's been a lot of controversy around lately regarding that game that was super popular for Let's Player era YouTube, which can't be loaded on most of the world's computers anymore, Yandere Simulator. The stuff that came out about this game and its developer thoroughly shocked the world. Or, at least, it shocked me, since I have a lot of fond memories about the title. Back when it first got big around 2014 or 2015, close to its initial release, Yandere Simulator was the edgy shitpost game of my dreams. I can't explain why, but way back when I had a personal goal to one day be in a school full of anime girls and to torture them all in horrific ways. So naturally, when I learned about Yandere Sim, it quickly became one of my favorite games, even though at the time it was only on its earliest, most bare builds. It was the perfect combination of goat simulator and sadism. It only became more appealing to me as development went on. Wow, I thought, watching YandereDev talk about his plans for rivals and countless elimination methods in his update videos. This game is going to be so complicated and extreme. Why aren't all the big game development companies pushing the envelope like this? Yandere Simulator is such a great, inventive, and inspiring game. In my own defense, I was, disgustingly young when I thought this. I hadn't even gotten around to actually playing the game at that point. But either way, I think we can both agree that I was completely wrong about that. Before we get any further, I just wanted to state that this is not going to be a video discussing YandereDev as a person, as there is nothing I could add to that cesspool which hasn't already been said. Rehashing other people's points is not what I'm about here. This video is meant to be a discussion about the game itself, as I think that with all the ridiculous drama surrounding the developer, there aren't a lot of people out there talking about the actual issues with the program. I know people like Asman have talked about why his coding techniques are inefficient. By the way, you should check him out, he's a pretty swell guy. But as for the actual content itself, I haven't heard a lot of meaningful criticism being thrown out there. Speaking of criticism, I'd also like to leave a disclaimer. Whatever. That I am not a seasoned veteran in the field of game design, so you can feel free to interpret my suggestions and critiques as opinion rather than objective fact. From my experience being a consumer of content on YouTube, it is far too easy to be swayed by any random Joe who presents their feelings with confidence online, even if they have no idea what they're talking about. That being said, however, for the sake of transparency, I also want to give you some reasons why maybe you should take me seriously. I've been working with various different game development softwares for a few years now, including Construct 3, GameMaker, and various versions of Unity, which is what YandereDev uses to make Yandere Simulator. Although I still consider myself a student, and definitely not on the same level of professionality as YandereDev, I believe that I have grown significantly in my study. Not to brag or anything, but I did happen to win 3rd place in a game jam on Newgrounds a while back. Being self-aware about it doesn't make it better. Being self-aware about it doesn't make it better. All that being said, the purpose of this video is not to assert that I am more talented or that my ideas are better than YandereDev's. This video and the statements I will be making are intended to be viewed as more of a contribution to a public forum, maybe a hypothesis, if you will, than a statement of definite truth. Now, are we all on the same page? Good. Back to the actual video. When all this drama started a while back, I was left with a burning desire to learn more about the curious tragedy of Yandere Simulator. I hadn't been following the game's development since 2015, aside from maybe the on and off Cub Scouts video every now and then. Upon gathering up what I could find, I came to two somewhat related conclusions. One, that not a lot of major gameplay had been added since the last time I'd been aware of it, although this is somewhat limited to what I personally see as progression. And two, that Yandere Simulator is a very weird game. This isn't exactly out of the ordinary. A lot of indie games can get pretty bizarre. However, Yandere Simulator isn't weird in that way. It isn't weird because the content is inherently strange, although I'd agree with you if you said it is. Yandere Simulator is weird because I don't think it knows or understands what it wants to be. This statement is open to a lot of questions. Doesn't everybody already know the goal of the game? Well, technically, yes. The game has an objective, or at least a projected objective, since Osana hasn't even been added in the game yet. We already know, for the most part, the story of the Yandere Simulator and what we will have to do to achieve Win State. However, just because Yandere Sim knows what it's going to be, doesn't really mean it knows what it is. Confused? Let me backtrack a little. One of the things that attracted many people to Yandere Sim in the first place was the freedom it gave you, even when there wasn't a goal to work towards. The game didn't tell you what to do. Hell, it didn't even give you something to do, nothing worthwhile anyway. It was a sandbox game where you did what you pleased and had wild fun with all its weirdness. It was, in every way, a classic simulator game. That was a big part of what brought its success on YouTube. People loved it for being open-ended, and while bugs were all too common, people cherished the game for it rather than scoffing at it as they do now. It was all a part of the sandbox charm. Looking at the game now, while it has changed a lot since those early builds, it is clear that YandereDev still maintains some of that endearment with the simulator aspect. He's always adding more and more wacky ways to eliminate your fellow students and expanding that freedom. Deep down, YandereDev is affectionate towards the early days of Yandere Sim, and he wants to make the game as complex as possible in the different options and routes the player can take. Now, I mentioned options and routes instead of just things you can do because, as many of us already know, Yandere Simulator has another identity, one which is much more linear in style. The entirely liberated sandbox phase was, after all, just that, simply a rest stop on the road to a completed game. In the end, YandereDev plans for the player to face 9 different rivals over the span of 9 weeks, each of whom plans to confess their love to Senpai at the end of their given run. Everybody knew that these rivals would exist at some point back in the earliest builds, however, I don't think that back in the day those people realized what this would mean for Yandere Sim as a game. Through the rivals, YandereDev wants to introduce to Yandere Simulator a sense of story and naturally progressing learning curve, where each rival gets more difficult to defeat than the last. Sounds fine on the surface, right? Well, to most people, and to me at first, yes, it did. However, when you get a little deeper into it and you observe all the struggles the game has faced throughout development, one glaring issue becomes incredibly clear. YandereDev doesn't know how to balance the sandbox part of the game with the linear part of the game. If you watch any one of the countless Osana update videos YandereDev has posted to his YouTube channel, chances are he'll tell you the same thing. That he cannot release her into the game yet because, at her current state, she would be too easy to eliminate. It is easy to see why. In the earliest builds, the player could kill virtually every student in the school, even without Easter eggs, because they had the freedom to do so. As time went on, YandereDev has programmed various methods of limiting this freedom, expanding on the still mechanics and programming certain students to be able to fight back, but notice what I just said there. YandereDev has had to limit his players' freedom. With the current state of the game, the player could, essentially, cheat through every rival without actually cheating. This is why Osana is taking so long to finish. Outside of the issues of YandereDev's vacations and his lack of motivation, he knows that out of every single feature in the game, there's bound to be one that the player could easily murder Osana with, so rather than just dropping a target in the game, he has to program Osana and everybody around her to act in a way which prevents the player from spawn killing her. He has to forcibly implement barriers to every single method in time unless it's one which he wants you to utilize, which seems a bit counterintuitive to me. The issue of YandereDev's game development abilities aside, this kind of seems like cheating. Why dangle all these options in front of you when, for the sake of gameplay, you'll only be able to access a small handful? Now, of course, a lot of games do this. It's known as the illusion of choice, and I'll talk more about that later. The main reason I have an issue with this in Yandere Simulator is because of how it ultimately affects the game itself. The need for that artificial progression of difficulty, as seen in many other linear-style games, has led to YandereDev believing that he needs 90 different students in the game in order for the threat of surveillance to be actually meaningful, since, as I stated before, with less it is possible for the player to kill almost all of them on spawn, or at least, in the event that the player is spotted committing a murder, to kill all the witnesses. This may be a fix, depending on how you view it, but if this is to happen, the game would likely be even harder to update and run, what with what we already know about YandereDev. The saturation of events and methods can work in a game, don't get me wrong, as teams have obviously managed to produce much more complicated games in the past, but with the way YandereDev handles development of his game, I prefer to see him as more of an individual than a company. Like any individual, he has feelings, gains and loses motivation, and experiences fatigue, and this directly impacts the outcome of his progress. It is also well known that YandereDev happens to be a particularly emotional individual, and this affects his progress as well. I know I promised I wouldn't bring YandereDev's personal drama into this, but I assure you that this is relevant to the actual progression of the game. Outside of the technical aspect, let's discuss some of the more subjective issues with this. For reference, I want to discuss a game called Postal 2. Postal 2 is very similar in gameplay and intent to Yandere Simulator. It's a game about completing missions, most of which involve over-the-top violence. When it comes to what you can do with the tools provided, there are virtually no limitations. You can even kill the priest in the confession booth after you complete the Confess Your Sins mission. There are a lot of different ways you can take this. It is very much a morbid sandbox game, and while it does give you the goals to complete, there are many different ways you can carry these out, all of which depend on how the player feels like completing the game. This is what I think Yandere Simulator wants to be, as Postal 2 more closely mirrors the expectations had for it than YandereDev's explanation of Hitman mixed with Persona. However, the methods YandereDev goes about implementing his missions are a lot different than the way Postal 2 presents theirs. Postal 2 generally offers the player two different courses of action they can take with each objective, a peaceful route or a violent one. The difficulty of each comes almost naturally. If the player chooses to remain peaceful, they will have to keep their focus on surviving all of the chaotic events taking place around them without any weapons. If they choose to go the more violent direction, they may be met with resistance from weapon-carrying NPCs like citizens and police officers, but generally, at least how I see it, the violent route is slightly easier. The difficulty and playstyle of Postal 2 comes directly from how the player chooses to complete their tasks, and this is what I like to think is true liberation, in the same style as early Yandere Simulator. The rival elimination in current Yandere Simulator, however, is a bit different. YandereDev wants each course of action to be equally difficult, and I will discuss more about why this in particular is a bad thing later. But for now I want to emphasize that, as a result of this, progressing the game's rivals is more difficult. For every new feature, YandereDev has to program corresponding counters, which not only negatively impacts the game's development, as he has stated as much that his motivation is affected by these factors, but also strips the player of the freedom of choice which once drew them to the game initially. Unlike in Postal 2, where the mission's difficulty is dictated entirely by the player, Yandere Sim is designed to not only tell you how hard the game is going to be, but when, where, and how you can eliminate the rival, which is where the real illusion of choice comes in. There are two problems that come about from this. One, the obvious issue of YandereDev's code, and two, the fact that the game is a lot less complex than it seems, rather than it is just stuffed with fluff. A lot of people complain about YandereDev not getting the meaningful stuff, like Osana, out of the way, and call the countless features useless because of this. I don't think that is necessarily correct. In the context of the original game, all of these kill styles would have been necessary to the full experience because Yandere Sim was a sandbox game, and the enjoyment came directly from the players experimenting. Now, however, YandereDev wants to make sure that the player cannot have this freedom because he sees it as a lack of difficulty, which renders a lot of the elimination methods virtually useless. Sure, there are a couple of options which might work at one point in the rival's routine, but YandereDev has to tell you when and where you can use them. The process is both tedious to the gameplay and the development, which is why I think Yandere Simulator will never see completion. YandereDev will continue to add new, unusable features, each of which delays the progress of Osana even further, pushing Yandere Simulator deeper and deeper into the abyss of the debug sandbox, until it eventually becomes unplayably broken, or YandereDev simply loses his drive entirely. Now, with that being said, how do I propose we fix this issue? When I was contemplating this, I came up with two general methods YandereDev could use to help fix this game. Wow, I really love using twos in this video. Option 1. Make it a full linear experience. YandereDev obviously wants to tell a story. Whether or not it is a good one is up to you to decide. While he can get little bits and pieces of the game's lore out to dedicated few who comb every last corner of the game's premises, as he did with items like the principal's tapes in the sandbox form, there is no way to guarantee that everybody who picks up the game is going to take it that seriously, and YandereDev really does want his game to be serious. He wants each element of the gameplay to be challenging and seriously make the player think. However, this can be pretty hard to do when the foundational structure of your game is sandbox in style, based around the player doing what they want rather than having the gameplay revolve around the story being told. There is no real way to force the player to challenge themselves. One obvious way in which YandereDev could fix this problem would be to change the style of the game and the way he develops it in order to make it more linear. What Yandere Simulator suffers from right now is the illusion of choice. In the end, there are only two real outcomes of any game: you either win or you lose. This much is true in Yandere Simulator as well. However, like other similar games which involve player choice, YandereDev also plans to implement different routes, or paths the player can take, all of which lead to different endings. He has discussed as much before in his update videos. Depending on how you play a game and how you eliminate your rivals, Senpai will react differently when you eventually offer him your love. If you cause all the rivals to reject him or fall in love with somebody else, his self-esteem will lower, which would probably lead to him accepting you more easily. A more neutral or mixed route would likely lead to him believing he is unlucky and that everyone around him is either doomed to harm or to leave him, probably causing him to push back on your advances. Finally, if you kill every rival and he finds out, it is suggested that he will take his revenge out on you. According to YandereDev, these endings will vary slightly depending on what specific methods of elimination you use, but ultimately we can boil this down to a good ending and a bad ending, with good and bad actions, with the exception of the half and half nature of the neutral path. Obviously, the good actions would be non-violent and do not result in the death of the rivals, and the bad ones would be the opposite. It is for this reason that I believe the structure and coding style of Yandere Simulator just doesn't make sense. Even when given a choice which results in either a good ending or a bad ending, YandereDev feels the need to make each playstyle equally difficult, as if he doubts the player's ability to put in effort for themselves if they really wanted to. He places the incentive of good and bad endings in the game, however he devalues it by putting effort into making every route as challenging as the others, instead of rewarding the player for the effort that they put in. Instead of making the more peaceful routes, which earn you a better ending, more difficult, which they are naturally, and letting the violent routes be generally easier, to tempt the player towards a more tedious, less self-gratifying experience, however with a more satisfying ending for their character, he takes what the game's endings already tell us is a selfish and foolish decision, and essentially tells the player that he doesn't trust them enough to play his game right. He takes away the important ability of the player to be able to choose. It makes the multiple endings feel unfair, as the bad ending is no longer criticizing you for taking the easy way out, rather leading to all the hard work you put in to be meaningless. And hey, if YandereDev wants the game to play out like that, that's completely fine. A lot of choose-your-own-adventure games, which handle the freedom of choice differently than sandbox titles, will throw in answers to which are inherently unfair, which the player could not have anticipated would lead to a bad ending. If he wants Yandere Simulator to play out more like a visual novel than Postal 2, it's his decision. However, if he were to do this, he'd need to change several things about the core game in order to avoid overstuffing it. Rather than give the player all these fancy weapons and methods only to tell them that they can only use a select few when the time is right, YandereDev could wait until certain events are triggered in-game to offer the player these weapons and options. Rather than coding all of the options first and the blockades later, YandereDev could design the weapons around each rival's schedules. He could reserve certain clubs to only be available during certain weeks, and design each elimination tactic around who the rival is as a person, enabling him to show off all the different tactics he's thought up. Doing this would drastically cut back on filler and eliminate the need for an overly populous school. It would be much better suited for what YandereDev wants to do with the game's story mode. If you really think about it, most choose-your-own-adventure games only give you around 3 or 4 different responses for every choice, often with multiple endings leading to the same conclusion. When it comes to Yandere Simulator, where you ultimately have only 2 ways to handle the rivals, do we really need so many different tools and tactics for murder? I personally know how tempting it can be to say, I want to put so many different choices and routes into my game, but in the end, is it really worth it? What does the player gain from all this? If you are given the option to stab Osana either with a butcher's knife or a carving knife, but you can only stab her at one specific time, and both the butcher's knife and the carving knife take about a week to program into the game, are they really worth it? Now, this is not to say that YandereDev cannot give the player options at all. A lot of people like the game for its variety and find experimenting fun. However, for the sake of YandereDev and for the sake of the players, if he wants to make Yandere Simulator a linear experience, he needs to cut down and distribute his weapons and methods more accordingly. This would make the difficulty progression in the game easier to design when YandereDev has more control over how the player can kill their rivals. The obvious downsides of this route would be, of course, the possible backlash from fans. Some might see the transition from sandbox to a completely controlled experience disappointing, and while this is a valid point, at the current rate the game is going, it would be better to complete it and risk losing a few fans than to go on making a game which cannot be finished. There are a lot of people out there who are invested in the story of this game and would not mind a more linear playstyle. If you really don't want to take away the sandbox aspect entirely, you could maybe make a separate mode, or add even more roleplay elements and side quests so that for those who enjoy that more, they can indulge themselves. Not everything about the game has to be controlled. Speaking of, I think it's about time to address the second game path, if that one wasn't appealing enough. Option 2. Make Yandere Simulator a simulator. As I mentioned before, a lot of the game's original appeal comes from freedom. It truly was a classic simulator game, and if the task of changing the game entirely is too much, you can fall back on what attracted people to it in the first place. Since I brought it up so often, you can make it more like Postal 2, and have the difficulty of the gameplay be decided by what direction the player takes in eliminating their rivals. Let the player decide what matters more to them, the story or having fun killing everyone. This is probably the best of both worlds, but I can understand why you wouldn't want to do this, mainly because Postal 2 is its own game and they already share quite a few similarities. However, Yandere Sim does have in it the potential to be different. The high school simulator aspect, as in interacting with other students, is something that I feel should be more important to the game, and could very well be what sets Yandere Simulator aside from other similar titles. When going peaceful, the game may take a more heavy focus on these interactions, reputation, and other social behaviors. You really could make Yandere Simulator half Hitman and half Persona, if you just shifted your focus on gameplay a little. Killing rivals is fairly easy, and that's by the game's design. You don't have to force the player to do something that they don't want to. That being said, there are other ways to take the game back to its sandbox roots. YandereDev could eliminate the rivals entirely and replace them with an RNG system which picks one student out of a select few who will confess to senpai at the end of each week. The actual challenge part could come mostly from figuring out who it would be based on clues and etc. Every student can have a specific routine, and it would be the player's responsibility to study them and watch for breaks in character. Yandere Simulator as a game doesn't need a complicated story to be fun and interesting for its fans. It didn't have any of that in the beginning, and yet it was one of the hottest games of its time. There are a lot of things YandereDev could do with that sandbox genre, and I think it's important for him to remember that that is always an option. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I was pretty excited about this when I first started writing the script. I felt like I was really wading into dangerous territory, and I really wanted to contribute to this discussion already going on around the game. However, now that I have had time to sit around and mull over it, I can't help but feel sad. A lot of people are dedicated fans of this game. I mean, I am to a certain extent. I do want to see this game succeed, not only for the fact that it could be good, but because of all the people who have poured their money and time into this project. In the current direction it's going, I'm genuinely not sure if YandereDev will ever finish his game. And I mean, can you really blame him? He is just one guy, and he's never really taken on something this big before. Regardless of his intent, he is scamming his fans. And with the way things are going right now, I'm worried about his future. So, to YandereDev, if by the very slim chance he is watching this, please consider what I've said, and what other people have said, and just in general, think about what you're doing. I know with all the criticism being thrown your way right now, it's difficult just being one guy, but if you continue like this, none of this is going to go away, probably ever. You're going to have this weight on your shoulders for the rest of your life, and the life of the internet, and whatever you choose to do after all of this is done, if it is ever done, will be forever tainted. Please, just keep that in mind. Well, all the heavy stuff out of the way, what do you guys think? Would these ideas work? Do you have any of your own? Does my mom have the big gay? Feel free to tell me in the comments. Also, I'm planning on making analysis videos similar to this in the future, and I've got another video somewhat like this about How to Train Your Dragon 3, so if you could check that out and maybe even throw me a subscribe, I'd be very appreciated. Mi casa es tu casa. As always, this is so sad. Can we hit 50 likes? I'll tip my fedora at 1 mil. This has been Scorchly. Goodbye.